This week, two Breeders' Cup races, one on one coast, that would be the Pat O'Brien at Del Mar, and one on the East Coast, the Sword Dancer at Saratoga. And we will focus in this preview on the Sword Dancer at 1.5 miles. It's always been an outstanding feeder race for the Breeders' Cup Turf, which this year will be at Keeneland. A field of 8 this year in the Sword Dancer, including 5, the first 5 finishers actually, from the Bowling Green at Saratoga back on August 1st. That would be Cross Border, Highland Sky, Channel Maker, Sadler's Joy, and Marzo. Also the first 2 finishers from the United Nations at Monmouth, Aquaphobia and Corelli. The other horse in the field is a new Gray Emotion trainee, Pedro Cara, who was second last fall at Belmont Park in the Jockey Club Invitational for 3-year-olds. All right, Mr. Bailey, you say you want to go in post position order and quickly touch on every horse in this field. So
that's how competitive I think it is. I think that we need to give them all just a little love. Almost all of them.
Let's do that. We'll start with the Rail and Highland Sky. I don't know when exactly we talked to Barclay Tagg about this horse. We had him in one of our NBC races, and one of the things that Barclay Tagg told us is that the horse has very little acceleration. He can't hit holes very quickly. I don't know if you remember this or not. So as a result, he's got to always go on the outside of horses. He can't really accelerate enough to be on the inside. So even though he's got post position number 1, you can look for Highland Sky circling the field at some point.
Yeah, you're right. But the reason I said let's do them all is because I think almost all of them have a chance to win. This is not one of them. I think he's going to run well. He always runs well, but he rarely wins, especially in graded stakes. So he'll run well, and for the reasons you mentioned, but I don't think he's going to win.
All right, number 2, Aquaphobia. We had him on our air on the Haskell undercard when he ran a very good race. Got a very good trip in the United Nations, if you recall, and he won it pretty impressively. Got a good number. He's in here with a good shot.
He had a perfect trip, and I think that's what's going to determine the winner of this race because they're all so close in ability. So I don't know that he's going to get that same perfect trip, but if he does, he definitely has a chance to win. He comes from 3 or 4 out of it, typically in a race this long. I don't know who's going to ride it. Okay, he goes from Joe Bravo to Irad Ortiz. So that's actually a move up. Even though Joe rode him perfectly, he definitely has a chance to win. But again, he has to have a good trip like he's been having.
On my formulator notes, beautiful turf trip. 3 words last time for Aquaphobia, trained by Mike Maker. Another Mike Maker horse, the logical pace setter in the field based on what he did in the Bowling Green, and that's Marzo, who opened up a 5-length lead early in the Bowling Green. Couldn't quite hang on, but did run badly, beaten a couple of lengths.
Yeah, this is the other horse I think it's probably unlikely to win just because I think they're going to use him as a pace setter. Now, he can run from 3 or 4 lengths off the pace, and he's won doing that. But I think because he has speed and nobody else really wants it in this race, that Maker is going to let him go ahead and set the pace. And I don't think he can hold off, as he didn't hold off in the Bowling Green.
All right, next in line is Channel Maker, a horse that has been competing in Grade 1 competition for a long time. It's a son of English Channel who's run in a couple of Breeders' Cup Turfs. He's run at a couple of Sword Dancers, runs with his head real high in the air. He's got a real awkward way of running. I know riders have to love that. You can get a bloody nose riding this horse. But he's probably not quite as good as he was a couple of years ago when he was really at his peak for trainer Belmont. But he's still competitive in races like this.
If you could bet at the 8th pole, in the middle of the stretch, you would take him at least half the time because he's always there. He always looks like he's going to win, but he rarely finishes it off. Once in a while, he'll put it together and go ahead and put his head in front. And yes, you said you'll recognize him by the horse running with his head highest, a nightmare for jockeys, basically because you can't see where you're going during the course of the race. So he'll run well, and he could win, but he's not one of my first 3 choices.
He was second in the Sword Dancer in, 2018, and he was 4th in the Sword Dancer in 2019. That is Channel Maker and Manny Franco. Corelli, Jonathan Thomas trainee. Again, we had him in the United Nations. He was coming off a first U.S. race in which he broke very slowly from the gate. Thomas worked with him, got him to break a lot better in the United Nations, and he wound up being 3rd behind Aquaphobia, beating a length and a half.
No excuse that day other than the winner had a perfect trip. He didn't have a perfect trip as the winner did, but he didn't have a bad trip either. He has got to run faster than that. I don't know if he can, but if he does, he's competitive.
He basically ran with Aquaphobia in sort of a mini match race in the United Nations. He was right outside of him. They made their moves together. The horse called Perrette was the pace setter. Both
Right.
of these horses closed in on Perret, but he just couldn't finish as well as Aquaphobia, who had more of an inside trip than Corelli did. Joel Rosario is aboard Corelli. Cross Border was put up in the Bowling Green by disqualification after Sadler's Joy created some havoc there in the final eighth of a mile. Cross Border, the third in this race, trained by Mike Maker, who was just loaded with older turf horses this year.
Yeah, good race. Obviously, he was declared the winner. I don't know. It was a tough call. Sadler's Joy was the best horse in the race. He did step in through the stretch. He did cause a chain reaction. Cross Border may have gotten the worst of it. But I think Sadler's Joy was the best horse on that day, even though he was disqualified. But this horse could win. Now, listen, there was, a neck between three of them at the wire. So, again, he had a good trip that day. He tipped out turning for home. He was in the 3 or 4 path through the stretch. He's got to have a decent trip. He doesn't have to have the perfect trip, but he has to have a decent trip to win.
The way I see this race playing out is Marzo going to the lead, Cross Border, along with Channel Maker and Aquaphobia, sort of right in behind Marzo, 2, 3, 4, depending on the break, depending on how things, jockey intent. I hate to talk about jockeys too much. I don't want to give you the big head. But, yeah, there you go. So, but Cross Border, numbers-wise, and just about every other way of handicapping, like you said, beating just a neck
Close.
last time out. Yeah.
They're close.
Pedro Cara, to me, is a very interesting horse. His very first start for Grey Emotion, hence, I think, the layoff from February in Saudi Arabia to August, even at a mile and a half at Saratoga, is not that much of a concern to me. Motion is such a good trainer, especially off a layoff. You got to just assume this horse is going to be fit. And his one U.S. race last fall in the Jockey Club Invitational Derby was a really good one.
He was terrific down the stretch. The last eighth of a mile, it looked like he was going to be a winner. At the eighth pole, you knew he was probably going to run down the horses in front of him. And then you see Jamie Spencer with his reins going everywhere. He dropped them. Of course, I'm a huge Jamie Spencer fan. And it's amazing he didn't hold on for a win. He ran a winning race that day last summer at Belmont, but he didn't win, actually last September. Yeah, he stands a big chance, I think. I tried to find him on YouTube. I couldn't find I found the race, but I couldn't find him in the race. But I don't think there's any concern, as you say, about how effective he'll be off the layoff. Motion's going to have him ready.
One of those good sons of Pedro the Great, John Velasquez aboard. I think he's got a great chance in here, and he'll be an excellent play. I think he'll be a good price. Okay, now the horse that's, to me, he's a really easy horse to root for. It's Sadler's Joy, who's been around forever. He's a 7-year-old trained by Tom Albertrani. I don't root for horses ordinarily, but I felt badly that he was disqualified last time because he's one of these horses that doesn't win that often. He's almost always knocking on the door.
The race before last, he had a 7-wide trip, which you don't need to have with this horse. As you say, he needs to run hard the last maybe 3/16 of a mile, probably only the last eighth of a mile, because if he makes the lead too soon, he pulls himself up. We pretty well documented that over the course of his career. The other day, he only was like 3 wide most of the turn. He tipped out into the 4 path. And I don't know. Javier, maybe he had just a mental lapse for a moment, but he cut it too thin. When you're dogfighting past horses the last eighth of a mile, boot to boot, you can't have your horse duck in at all. And he did slightly. I don't think it was much, but it was just enough with other horses trying to fill gaps inside of him that he did cause a chain reaction. So he was the best horse in my mind. I think with the same kind of trip, he can win again. And I don't look for that to happen again. He generally runs pretty straight, and Javier will be on point, I think, this time, making sure it doesn't happen.
A very intriguing, interesting race in the Sword Dancer. Again, one of 2 Breeders' Cup Challenge races this weekend. This one at Saratoga. The other one, again, the Pat O'Brien at Del Mar. And we'll be with you next week for another Breeders' Cup Challenge. When and you're in preview.